Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third installment into our in our pre-Annie new player guide explanation videos for every single Realms Awakeners. And today we're with everyone's favorite vampires and baby eaters. We're in Caro. This is by far a very popular realm. And so, before I go into the details, I would like to remind you all that we have a vibrant and helpful community, and this is a mere overview. And so, if you want to get a better explanation on any of these specific characters, there are both plenty of people who can provide that, as well as those who are happy to. And the reason why I am emphasizing this is because these next two videos are going to be Caro and Ultra, which are just the two realms I am least familiar with. I am still educated enough to give this guide, but they won't be as proficient as, say, a Chaos or a Core guide. So, as always, we start with the standards. And yes, go with the DPS first off to be simple. And the first thing that needs to be established for if you want to use a standard Caro DPS, especially in the later stages, you're going to want them to have Overexalt. And so Hellet, for example, specifically is going to really want her up to Enlighten 3, because you really want to get the irregular form card, which I will explain what that does in a minute. You really want to have that ease of crit rate, but more importantly, you want her to gain crit damage whenever she plays her strikes. Because Hellet is a strike scaling character. Her entire kit revolves around generating and playing strikes. So this card, the Lasting Loath, is a 1 mana generate 2 strikes. It also does a bit of damage and causes you to lose a percentage of your max health. You'll notice throughout this video that Caro tends to lose a lot of their HP a lot. It's not max health, it's current HP. I should clarify. But yeah, you'll notice throughout the video, Caro tends to lose a lot of their HP. And then, so her Rouse also just boosts the damage of these two cards, which is very good, because when I say she's a strike scaler, I mean she both wants to scale up strikes. She, makes the base damage of her strikes increase by 10% whenever she devours. And when her Exalt also just gives strike damage increase for the turn. Which I realize now that I forgot to explain something, and I will in a minute. But first, you want to have a lot of strikes. You want to generate a bunch of strikes. You want to draw 3 strikes with the Devour effect from her Exalt. And then you want to play the Shattering Strike, because it is also a strike. But it's a strike with scaling damage, and a lot of scaling damage, mind you, for each other strike in your hand. So you generate strikes with Lasting Loaths, you produce a bunch of strikes, you play this Shattering Strike, big strike damage. And her OE is also really important for her, because now you're going to get 2 irregular forms and more crit damage when you overexalt with her. And what are the irregular forms? Irregular form is a Hellet mechanic that is unique to her. It's a unique card where you can basically copy any one of her cards that are normally in your deck for free and put it into your hand. When I get to Hellet Katena, which is her Genesis version, she has a similar mechanic that makes her really powerful. She has the exact same mechanic, I should say. And so that's why with this character, you just want to keep generating strikes and being powerful with that. Now, you'll notice I kept saying Devour, and that Devour was very important, especially on her, and that is because this is Caro. So each Caro Awakener, what's special about their kit is that every time you exile with them, if you have a baby in hand, if you have one of the embryo cards that Caro generates, which was explained in a previous video, I'm just going to once again go over it. If you devour an embryo, a zero cost card that Caro units generate, while if you exalt while that is in hand, you get an empowered exalt. And basically, you want to be empowering your exalts. Not always, not every, but generally speaking, the Caro units want to eat the embryos when they exalt. I will go over the exceptions, but for now, go if you're thinking about playing Caro, just go with it with the intention of always using those embryos to empower the exalt when you use it, not to give them more alienness. And so that was Hellet, relatively very simple character. Which now we have Uvosh, and Uvosh I really would not recommend trying to play before you get him up to Overexalt. He is just a very awkward character before it because his Overexalt is he literally fills your hands with a card, and he increases the damage he does for the turn. So obviously a very powerful Overexalt effect, but it's really about filling that hand with the Screechblade card because the Screechblade card is this zero cost card that does damage to all enemies and increases his strength. So you're getting a lot of scaling damage for the turn, and you're basically wiping out everything. A max level Uvosh with like literally zero investment. So going into and when I mean investment, I mean like zero setup. I should say not investment with zero setup going into the turn with just Overexalt and an empty hand is easily doing more than like 300,000 damage, which is enough to easily clear any normal mod wave and like any mob wave in stories. And it's 300,000 total, so but it's like it's doing 100,000 damage. That's easily enough to clear any mob wave. That's most bosses. It's it can be very he can be very very powerful, and the reason why is because his devour effect gives him increased damage, increased strength multiplier. He gains but it's mostly just about playing that Screech Blood. And then he also really wants to play his Boil Blood and his card to regenerate his Alienus at the end of that. Because you just want to be constantly spamming that Overexalt on him to be generating all of the Screech Bloods to do maximum damage. You want his Rouse because it increases his crit rate and damage to do even more damage, and he's a very, very, very hyper aggressive unit. You pair him up with units like Horla and Thighs to just recharge his aliens back up all the way, and then you pair him up with characters like Feint to stack up a lot of death resistance because you really just have no intention of tanking hits with anything but your face. You focus just entirely on maximizing that damage output. And so that's why characters like Horla is really good because your actual HP value doesn't make a difference. It's a more you just want to generate Alien Miss so you can generate Screech Bloods so you can play the Screech Bloods and kill the mobs. So since I mentioned her, you just go on to Feint next. Feint is a really cool Awakener actually because you can pretend that none of these techs exist. Her cards, they're nice, but they don't matter. Her cards are just like more defensive strength, more healing and stuff. The reason why Feint is considered so strong, and if you ever really want to use her on your teams, you don't even need to get a single Enlightened Fur. She's perfectly good at E0. Only if you want to use her for like counter damage, because she does do a bit of counter damage, but that's not why she's valuable. This is purely like an end game concept, so you don't really have to worry about it. But if you want to use her for counter damage, you basically get more counter damage when you have her up to E3. She's very good at dealing damage with counter when you have her up to E3. But that's not important. What's important about her kit is that she has this very unique ability compared to every other character in the game, and she doesn't really care about the Devour because of it, because all her Devour does is just give her a card in hand. No, what you really care about, I guess it also inflicts the weakness, which is always good, but like, what you really care about is that whenever she exalts, she gives you death resistance. that is the big thing with Fang, is that she is the only character in this game that will be scaling up your death resistance mid-run. There are certain relics that do the same in Arc 1, but not in Arc 2 rule set, not in the Astral Rain rule set, and only she gives you more death resistance. Add that is that her rouse, none of the other lines of text matter. She causes you to take 45% reduced death resistance from proccing instead of 50%. So normally whenever you proc death resistance, it's cut in half from that point on. So if you get 300%, it gets cut in half to 150, 150, 75. With the 45%, it's minus 5% on that. So you're saving up to more like 80%, right? Very, 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 very powerful effects. Very good. Feint is one of the best defensive units in the game, especially in endgame, where you just have to tank stuff with your face sometimes. She's really good at breaking the Astral Rain rule set against DR stacking, and she's just the best death resistance character in the game. One of the best supports in the game if you're looking for that defensive utility. Very unique in her operation. Very, very powerful. So, in that case, I will bring us on to a much weaker defensive unit, Agrippa. So Agrippa is considered actually a somewhat solid but extremely weak Awaker. If you look at her on tier list, she's going to be one of the lowest rated ones. I would rate her to be like a bit on the weaker side as well. She's just not fit for Caro mechanically. If she was a different realm, she'd be very good. Because her whole thing is gaining alert and stacking poison. So Caro doesn't really care about shields a lot of the time. It really is not a very defensive color. It really wants to be more aggressive. You'll notice the two Awakers I described earlier were ones that are constantly trading away their HP to deal more damage. And then Feint, who does you don't care about your health at all, really, or shielding at all. You're just taking everything with your face. Agrippa, therefore, is just not fit for the realm she's in, unfortunately. If she was a Chaos or an Caro Awakener, she would actually be very powerful. She would be considered very powerful. Because what her ult does, and this one you really want to do the Devour, is that it gives her permanent stacking alert. Alert is increased shielding effects on cards, and she is the only unit in the game that really will give you permanent alert. So she's very, very powerful in theory. And then if you get her up to Enlighten 3, her colorless spiral cards actually do a decent amount of damage and generate embryo fusion. And the colorless spiral card is a card that just deals damage and applies an equal amount of poison. So you can also redraw it when you use Devour. So she actually can provide a little bit of poison damage early game if you have her up to E3. And her embryo fusion actually is pretty good. Her 2 cost, if you're ever playing this character in later stages, is because of her 2 cost card, the Reluctant Alms, because it just doubles your current embryo fusion. And if you have decent key flare, that is basically the same as saying you're generating an embryo. So if you get her up to E3, she is a pretty solid embryo stacker, and you can off color her and say like Caro Awakener and set up a more like defensive comp with high alien misgen, for example. Because the embryos you can just feed to generate alien miss, or you can devour with her to get the alert. So a very interesting character, just unfortunately not in a realm that's suited to her. And meanwhile, this brings us to like what is considered by many to be one of the worst Awakers in the game. Admittedly, a lot of players also think she's pretty powerful. But generally speaking, I would say she is one of the worst Awakers in the game because of these numbers right here. Literally lowest stat line in the game. The only character in the game that competes to have worse stats is Horla, and Lei loses to her in like every stat. It just shows like how weak this character is. Her stats are very poor. And then what she really does is just she trades away your HP to generate a little bit of embryos and strength temporarily. She has this pain and pleasure card, which is actually kind of useful at times, where if you're getting multi-hit one turn, you can, or you're just taking a lot of damage really, you get a part of it back as shield for a turn, so she serves to give you a bit of temporary health. And then if you max out her ult, she can also provide you a decent amount of healing with her Exalt, because the Devour Exalt will restore a bit of your HP and cleanse your vulnerable status. And so if you want a vulnerable cleanse, for the very few fights that do, she can actually provide a bit of healing. But you're definitely going to want her to get up to at this E2 at least, so that her cards give you Alien Miss, and that you can hold on to the 3-cost shielding card. Because you're really just going to play her cards as... I want to say just like as a support, right? You don't really try to play her cards, but if you have nothing better to do, that's when you usually play her cards. And she does not have a Soul Force talent, but she does have this like unique mechanic that no one really talks about, where these two heals are separate. So she'll restore your lost HP from the Devourer, and then she'll give you base values, which means you can like get double heals off of her, effectively. So her healing on Devour can actually be pretty high when you're really low health, but you just have low max health when you have her on your team. She's not a unit I would recommend to people, but if you do have her at E2, she's definitely a serviceable unit that you can play with for a while. I can't say I recommend her in endgame just because she's supposed to be an embryo fusion and a healer, but I just think Agrippa might even Agrippa might be more useful to you a lot of the time. And speaking of embryo fusions, we have the only welfare unit in Caro and one of the best units in the game. So this is Aegis. She's very cute. You're really gonna want her to get up to that first Enlighten, because that first Enlighten gives it that her strike can generate embryo fusion for you. And so what does her kit do? It's her Exalt that matters. You'll notice mine's only at level 2, because leveling it only increases damage. You really don't care about the level of this Enlighten at all. Well, this Exalt at all, because it has the most powerful Devour effect in the game, which is it inflicts a turn of Petrify on all enemies. And as you can read here, petrified enemies cannot act for 1 turn. So this will literally stall an enemy out for a turn. And it has like 3 million different uses, right? So if you petrify a character while they're rousing, so like anyone in that immunity state that's about to gain a buff, because a lot of characters do that. Any Awaker boss, for example, does that. She will just cancel that for a turn, and then the next turn you can kill them while they're trying to rouse. Or you can just prevent mobs from hitting you for a turn, and then it also just applies vulnerable. Like this Exalt just applies 2 stacks of vulnerable. And each time you do the Exalt, it increases the damage of the Exalt, which once again, her damage doesn't really matter. She's a support. She's just set up to deal so that you can do damage to enemies, but that's where her power comes in. That she can apply this extremely absurd debuff and vulnerable. In fact, she is just straight up a vulnerable bot. Her small wish card will generate vulnerable for you. And then her decomp, when you have vulnerable, is just free, so you just play that when it's free. But yeah, what you're really just doing with this character is at least once a fight, you get her up to Exalt, you devour an embryo, and then you stun all the enemies for a turn. And apply vulnerable. It's just a very... I can't stress how powerful the effect is, or because you just have to see it for yourself and you would understand. And notably, you also do want to get her up to Overexalt eventually, because when you can get it up to that when she overexalts for a turn, all your Awakener's damage is increased by 25%. So this is a final damage increase, which basically just means it's a very powerful multiplier on your damage. And this can allow you to do just absurd damage numbers, will get you up to be very, very strong, and then make any fight really into a joke.
But yeah, also when you get her up to E3, it's very interesting. Whenever you devour a card, you will put her vulnerable into hand, and that's only if it's in the discard pile, not in the draw pile. So when I say she's a Vuln bot, I truly do mean it. Gives you Exalt, apply Vuln. It gives you a 0 cost Small Wish, you play that. But then your decomp is 3 because they have Vuln, so you can just play that. So you're only really playing their cards if they cost effectively nothing, and you're just applying Vuln. It, I, she's just very good. So that's it for welfare. That just leaves us to our year 1 limiteds, which are Salvador, Sorel, and Thighs, and I believe Helet Katena as well. So, yeah. These four are our year 1 limiteds. These will all be entering into the standard banner soon. I will start with Sorel. I'm starting with Sorel because she is the weakest of the three. I will do Helet Katena and Thighs last as they are the most powerful. But Sorel is considered by the entire community to be like one of the weakest limiteds in the game, and someone who requires her Overexalt to do damage. Because her Overexalt just sets up her damage to be even stronger, as well as heal her up. So that's Sorel's whole mechanic, is that she takes a bunch of damage, right? With her, she loses 10% HP. She's in Caro, they're constantly losing their max HP. And then you get her down to low HP. You, funnily enough, do infinite devour with her. So with her, she is the unique mechanic that she can eat as many embryos as she wants. And then for each embryo she eats, it's just more damage she's doing with her Exalt, and it already hits 6 times. So she's this absurd multi-hit Awakener with her Exalt, and then her 2-cost card also deals 4 instances of damage. And so what you do with this character, simply, is just charge up her Overexalt, have a bunch of embryos in hand, and then just hit the boss for like 30 times. You just do so many hits, and even if you lost like 90% of your HP in the process, you heal up at least like half of it. And Caro is highly functional at half HP, for example. So with that being said, and remember the Acor video, I talked about how Acor really likes multi-hit stuff with Red Sand. So Sorel can be considered an Acor DPS as well. It's not. I think a lot of members of the community don't say it's her strongest combination, but for a lot of players, if you have a Sorel, if you want to make her really powerful, you can just put her in Acor, swap over to that red stance, and then get all that value. And it's a highly viable combination because you are just getting so many hits and instances of damage. And now we have Salve, and Salvador is a completely different beast. If the last unit was all about like being aggressive, this guy is very slow. When I said Caro doesn't really care about shielding or anything, I was ignoring this guy because Salvador introduced the Soul Furnace mechanic to Caro. Soul Furnace is the Caro mechanic where you have a little ball of healing that you can click on when you need it. And it was introduced in the game with Salvador's release, and he is the one who synergizes with it. His whole kit is built around this. So you have his End of Suffering card, which is his whole mechanic. It has one of 3 options for you. You either charge up the Soul Furnace with the main use of it. Every time you play the Soul Furnace, almost every time, basically, you're going to use it for that, to charge up his Soul Furnace. The End of Suffering, I mean. Every time you play the End of Suffering, you're going to use it to charge up a Soul Furnace. And then he's either going to... Then you have a choice where you can either use it to do damage or to shield up. So you can shield for, I believe, double the Soul Furnace value, for 150% of the current Soul Force value, or you can do one just huge nuke attack with if you max out your soul furnace with the option. So those are the three. It's charge it up, use it for a huge shield, or use it for a huge burst, and then the rest of his cards are literally like gain Crimson Furnace stacks. Gain for each bit of furnace you have gain damage, right? Apply weakness so you can stall longer to set up for more furnace and gain more furnace. So his whole shtick really is stacking up this End of Suffering strength, stacking up Soul Furnace, occasionally using it to shield to survive a hit, and then just nuking everything. And the thing is, the End of Suffering is his DPS option. It hits everything. So no matter what's on screen, he's hitting you with the End of Suffering. This guy is a extremely viable endgame unit. He's just he can be very difficult to operate around. But but you only need him up to Enlighten 2, because that basically just gives him all his scaling and damage and all that. And so once you have him up to Enlighten 2, he can just be a very powerful end game DPS, albeit a very slow performing one. And now we have Hellet and Thighs. So Hellet Katena is the best DPS in the game, and Thighs is the best support unit in the game. You might hear some people disagree with me on this, but it's never a question of who is of these two being in the top three. It's always just a question of, are they the best unit. So Hellet Katena can be said to be the best DPS unit in the game, and I don't mean like as a DPS. I mean like literally fastest, biggest burst damage, highest damage numbers being hit. And then Thighs if she is not the best support in the game, she is the second best support in the game, just simply put. So we'll start with Hellet Katena. And so Hellet Katena has a lot of text for what ends out being a very simple kit. So you're gonna want to get to E3, because whenever at E3 you have an irregular form card, and then you also do want all the effects that come before this, basically. But the E3 is very important because, one, she can just nuke enemy shields. So if you're against a boss that has shields or anything, those shields no longer exist. So that can be very important if you're dealing damage. And then you want to start with an irregular form. As I mentioned earlier with Hellet, irregular form gives you one of her 4 cards, and the card you're picking is the Crimson Shackle. Because what this card is that it's a 1-cost card that you play 3 times, and it transforms into a 4-cost card called the Bloodthirsty Flail. And when you have her at E3, this card has Prepare 2, and so the Bloodthirsty Flail's cost gets reduced by 2 every turn. And then so you make one of these, and then you try to fill your hand with them through a variety of ways, the most common being the Chapter 7 Covenant Lone Seed, playing more Shackles, and then Thighs Exalt when I get to it later. And so you fill your hands with a bunch of these. You devour a card, an embryo with her Katena Exalt, because it increases the damage you're doing this turn. Removes all the shield because of the Exalt. Well, because of the Enlightens, right? And also does a little bit of damage. So it increases it increases all the damage you're doing and adds bleed to it, because your damage scales with bleed. The Devourer causes all your Hellet cards to get reduced by 1. And so now all your flails that you've generated and have been holding on to cost either 1 or 0. And I'll explain how they cost 0 later. Other than the obvious having them in hand. And then you just play a bunch of them, and you're easily getting these absurd, like, hundreds of thousands, easily hitting 1,000,000 damage numbers in a single turn, stacking up like 500,000. Like mine, who is not super highly invested, easily, like with level 4 talent, no skills maxed out, and then level 60, easily does like over 1,000,000 damage on with the correct setup. easily kills basically any boss in the game. And it all comes down to you play that shackle, create flails, devour an exalt, and then just play your cards out, and it will just nuke the board. So, and once again, that's the very simple overview. In the future, I will make a video that explains in depth how to play her. But to be fair, you don't really need a more complicated overview. Once you've played the comp one time, you tend to get a feel of how she plays. Her best, you basically always play her with both a Aegis support, as I talked about earlier, because it will give you the Petrify Exalt in order to apply Vuln to everything for more damage, and then as well as to delay a turn to build up more flails and to not die, because if you're taking a turn to build up a flail, you can very easily die because it does cost you 30% of your current HP when you do so. It comes down to around about 27% of your max HP on the first turn. 26, 27. And then you run Thighs, because what Thighs does is that if you have her at E2, one, her Exalt reduces the cost. I should first explain what her Exalt does. Blah, 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 blah. None of this matters. Put two cards in hand. That is any card you have in your hand, basically. Put two copies of it with cost reduction by one. When you have her E2, it reduces the cost by two. So, what our Exalt reads is a bunch of text that basically no one cares about, and then put two cards into your hand that have their cost reduced by two. And so you can copy the flails that Gellet makes, for example. You can copy the End of Suffering of Salvador, and make these effectively free. And that way you're able to play these really powerful cards over and over again. When you have her at E2, you also have her at E1. And having her at E1 increases the effect of her Sacred Blood's Instinct card, which is one of these two cost cards. It's this one. And so if you don't have a really powerful, like, Caro DPS card you can copy, you also could just copy one of her two cost cards and make them zero cost. This one being her Alienus generating card, so you can easily build up a lot of charge on a fellow Waker, and then also recharge up that Exalt to copy a card in the future, or the Sacred Blood, which does one of three things. It always generates a lot of Embryo Fusion when you play it. See, mine currently generates 40%, so it generates a lot of Embryo Fusion when you play it. It generates a lot of Key Flare when you play it. And then it also either applies 2 turns of weakness at Enlighten 1, 2 turns of Vuln, or 40% Embryo Gen. So all these are extremely powerful effects. I shouldn't have to explain why 2 turns of weakness or 2 turns of Vuln are really good. And the Embryo Gen is you're always trying to stack up embryos on Caro, so the more embryos you have, the better. And normally you either are going to be playing it for that weakness or that Embryo Gen, because you tend to try to already have the vulnerable applied in advance. But you can also use it just to maintain vulnerable, if you like. And I guess I should explain now why this character is so good. It's just she does everything you want a support to do. She builds up a tiny bit of strength. She builds up Alienus. She applies the most powerful debuffs in the game, weakness and vuln. She gives you embryos, and embryos are always good. She generates a lot of key flare, and she literally does everything. The one unique aspect of her kit I haven't talked about is her rouse yet. Her rouse is really important. It's very special because it adds basically a super embryo into your hand. The super embryo's effects are it gets double devour triggers. So for Helicatena, for example, it reduces all the cards in her hand by one, which she devours a normal embryo. You do this, it's doing it by two. It reduces all the cost by two, and so you generate the 2 cost flails with this Exalt. You eat the super embryo that the Thighs Rouse produces. Boom! All your flails are going to cost 0. Like basically, all your flails are going to cost 0. And then whenever you use your keeper ability, and you have Rouse Thighs, if you have a Scion in hand, it also will an Embryo in hand, it will transform it into one of those super babies. And so you can generate super babies that way. It's very good. And so that's it for year 1 limiteds. That brings us to the year 2 limiteds for Dorsane and Pikmin. And they're interesting characters. Dorsane Kit doesn't actually require much explanation. You're going to want him up to Enlighten 3, because this Enlighten 1 gives him more crit rate, which is very important because he struggles with crit rate. This Enlighten 2 just gives him more damage the lower HP he is. And, you know, we talked about in Caro how often you're at low HP. So that's obviously going to be good. And this is the big one, because what it is that he generates a card when he kills a mob. It's technically whenever he gains a corpse stack, and when he gains a corpse stack almost exclusively from killing things. And so whenever he kills something, he generates a card called an Everknight's Revel. And then this does damage to everything on the board, so he's really efficient at clearing mobs when he's highly invested. And then for each one you play in a turn, they get scaling damage for the turn. So in boss fights, you really want to hold on to them for a big burst turn, so that you can potentially just clear the bosses in like one big burst. As far as the rest of his kits, very simple. It's you lose HP to apply Vuln to all enemies and do a bit of damage. You Exalt to do a big burst of damage. And then if he has 3 corpse stacks, which is like technically maximum stacks he can have, he will heal up a decent amount of HP as well. And do a lot of damage with the Exalt damage. And then his Dirge, his Devour on his Exalt, and his Rouse all just increase the strength he gains, and like they give him more strength, and then he has increased strength bonuses. So if you have a lot of strength, he does a lot of damage, and he also just has a lot of strength scaling, so he does a lot of damage. And his whole idea is that he just generates a bunch of strength and one shots things. So yeah, very simple kit. It doesn't really require much explanation to get comfortable with. You just Exalt, you play the cards, you do damage. And Pikmin's a bit more complicated. Pikmin's actually probably the most complicated Caro unit in application, because Helicatena can be very complicated in theory until you actually learn her functions, and then she can be a relatively simple character. And a lot of other characters boil down to basically play their card when you see their card. But he has a lot of text, right? Because he's very complicated. He's much more unique in Caro. So his big thing is that he has this 2-cost card. And the Lifelike Rendition generates a bit of Embryo fusion, so he's good if you want to get Embryo. And then he also gives you a silver relic for a turn. And then if you can get him up to like Enlighten 2, they become gold relics. And you do kind of want him to get up to Enlighten 2 if you're trying to see his at full power level. You also kind of want him at E3 for like the whole creativity mechanic, but this is not really used by people genuinely. His E2 is like more of the big power spike. And you definitely want him on Enlighten 1 just so his strike or defense will draw a other Awaker's card per turn. So that's another useful thing about him, is that you can like cycle through your deck a little. You know, draw cards like the Dirge on Dorsane, for example. But yeah, so you get a choice of a number of silver relics. In Arc 2, they are a bit more powerful, because it will like apply a turn of weakness or vuln onto an enemy, and which can be useful. Or 2 turns of weakness and vuln if you have him up to Enlighten 2, which is really good. And then, other than that, his whole thing is like discovering cards, and so discovers, obviously, you require a bit of thinking to play around, right? You want to be manipulating your hand with all that. So when he devours, the next card you play is reduced by 2, and then he also looks at cards that are in your deck, like basically he will show you a combination of three cards based off the Awakers you have in your library. You can't. It's not like to wheel where you generate cards that are not already in your deck. These are new cards, but they're all cards that your Awakers already possess. And then his so that reduces costs, and then this 4 cost card is this big deal a lot of damage to all mobs and steal a lot of strength that gets reduced every time you discover it for the turn. And so just his Exalt Devour alone will make this cost 1 for the turn. And then if you do another Discover effect somehow, then that will make that Chromophage cost 0. So if you want to use him as like a strength scaling support or a DPS, you make a bunch of copies of the Chromophages, try to reduce their cost with Discover effects, and then do like a big burst that way. But normally you're just gonna probably play it like once or twice. Reduce the cost a little bit if you're using the more normal ways of support. You try to reduce the costs with some discovers to steal a bit of strength from the enemies for a turn, and either survive by weakening them or deal a bit of damage that way. And other than that, there's not really much to talk about with him, because the rest of his details of his kit are just not really relevant. it's it's just all hard to proc and stuff. It's not practical, and these are meant to be like practical guides. So for this character, the practical explanation for him is you play as you either run him as a support, you play as 2 costs to generate like relics for a turn, as well as gain embryo. You use his exalt to generate cards you want, as well as uh, as, as well as reduce their cost temporarily. And then if you want him as a DPS, you want to make copies of the Chromophage card. You want to discover to reduce the cost of the Chromophage card, and then you want to play like a dozen Chromophage cards in a turn. I can safely tell you though, I've seen testing for it. This is not a powerful way to play the game. He is not actually that effective as a DPS. The Chromophage can potentially be used as a supportive element for certain non-off meta comps, but if you want him on your team, it's only because you want those other effects that I was describing. That's why you should be running Pikmin. And so that's it for Caro. I know I was a little rushed, and the explanation for bit the characters were lacking, but these are true. It's truly the most like simplified, practical explanation for each one of how you're playing their kits. But it all boils down to really two different types of characters in Caro. You have your supports that want to generate embryos. And then you have your DPS that you want to eat the embryos for these big, powerful exalts that will kill everything. And then you have the rare Feint, Aegis, and Salvador, which are your defensive options. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope this was informative, and I hope you all had a great day.